Good day everyone, I am Rainner Delos Reyes and I will be continuing our report about the Japanese occupation of the Moroland and its aftermath. So what were the people's reactions to the Japanese occupation? The initial reaction of the people in Moroland on the day of the Japanese invasion was a mixture of fear, surprise, and shock. In Sulu, for instance, nobody thought that the Japanese would actually come to Holo and occupy it. In fact, the landing forces of the Japanese only met a very weak resistance of the fight, lasting only about 2 hours. The Moro people did not expect the Japanese to invade, although they were aware of the invasions happening in the other countries in Asia, but they never did expect that the Japanese would come to Sulu and to Mindanao to occupy it. And they never expected it, especially on Christmas Eve. Following the events, as with other Filipinos in the country, the issue of collaboration with the Japanese also beset the Moros. The spearheaded collaboration by President Jose P. Laurel, which was a collaboration of the Filipinos and the Japanese, certainly shook and surprised the Moros. Certainly, the Moro leaders then thought it was better to cooperate with the Japanese than to suffer the new colonizers' wrath and cruelty. But for those many who cooperated with the Japanese, it was to ease the suffering of their people. It was their own way of making the best out of a very bad situation. For example, of the Sultan Saramayin, Alaoya Alonto, who articulated his position in a letter to the American colonel who commanded the Mindanao guerrilla units. He wrote the letter which says, "Before the surrender, I assured the late General Fort and all the cooperation that could possibly come from me. And even after the surrender, I wanted to carry on the fight with my people who had been faithful to me and loyal to our cause, and I have resolved then to stay in the forest, which I could possibly do even for years. But with the Japanese threats to burn houses and harass my people, after a thorough and mature deliberation, I had no alternative except to surrender to protect life and property from lawlessness and cruelty of our enemy. As a senator-elect, it is my paramount duty and a sacred one above everything else to render my people such service, which I have been executing day in and day out since that fateful day of my surrender for the sake of the civilian population, especially women and children." So, Sultan Alaoya Alonto had no other choice but to surrender to the Japanese for the safety of his people. The above viewpoint would also be shared by other Moro leaders, Dato Umbra Amil Bangsa, Dato Sali Ututalum, and Dato Gulamu Rasul of Sulu, and Dato Sinsuat Balabaran, and Dato Menandang Piang of Cotabato, who were among the Moro leaders who thought it was in the best interest of their people to go along with the Japanese policies. But then, the Japanese saw that they could not succeed in their aim to colonize the Moros with sheer force. They then appealed to the Moros as their brother Asians. The Japanese would then resort to involving the younger generation of Moro leaders in seminars and leadership training programs in the hope of re-educating and reorienting their predispositions and perspectives along Asian or Japanese lines. However, seeing that the Japanese did not have enough resources to sustain and manage those kind of efforts, they did not achieve colonizing the Moros. So the Japanese were trying to re-educate the young Moro leaders to follow what they believed to be Asian principles, in the hopes that they could colonize and change the perspectives and the culture of the Moros into something that is more on the Japanese culture, because the Japanese that time, they were trying to do an expansion and they were invading and colonizing countries from within Asia, and they were trying to change their point of views, their beliefs into Japanese beliefs, into which the Japanese believed to think was the only right way and the just way as the principle of Asia. They thought that their principles, or them invading the countries, was them colonizing the people of the right and true ways. However, if there was one thing that the Japanese achieved during their occupation of the Moroland, it was the guarded and enthusiastic obedience of the Moros living in the occupied towns. So what was the impacts of the Japanese occupation on the Moroland and its people? So after the war ended, when the US dropped atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese eventually came to a surrender which ended the World War II. So it had almost insignificant or ephemeral effects. Yet, in spite of the briefness, it had in fact three long-lasting effects on Filipino and Moro relations. As Peter Going says, first was that Japanese occupation wielded Muslim and Christian alliances which continued after the war. Many Muslims found satisfaction in fighting side by side with the Christians against a common invader, and so participating in the defense of the Philippines. So as we can see now, we have Moro leaders and officers in the guerrilla units of the Philippines. We have generals and high-ranking officials that are part of the Philippine Air Force or the Philippine National Police, and also in the Philippine military. For example, after the war, President Sergio Hosmeña appointed Muslim guerrilla leaders to political offices after liberation. One example is Dato Salipada Pendaton, which eventually became the governor of Cotabato. Dato Salipada Pendaton was also the first Filipino Muslim in history to hold political offices. Dato Manalao Mindalano also became the executive committee of the Philippine Veterans Legion in Manila. Dato Manalao Mindalano was the regimental commander of the 127th Infantry Regiment, 108th Infantry Division, and 10th Military District, who was granted the Silver Star Medal for his valor action in the Battle of Malabang, Lanao. The Moros also ran in the 1946 national elections, in which they ran successfully for two political parties, namely the Nacionalista and the Liberal. Second, the war damage, reparations, payments, and back pay awards to many Moros officially recognized as former guerrillas resulted in a significant increase of moneyed wealth in Moroland. This in turn helped finance a resurgence of Islam post-war Moroland, as more money was available to fund increasing numbers of pilgrims on the Hajj, build mosques and madrasas, and support large public religious ceremonies and other prestigious events. The rising economic status also helped fuel dissatisfaction in the Moros' place in the Philippine Republic. Resurgent Islam served to reaffirm their Moro selfhood and sense of nationality in the major Christian population. So as discussed by the previous reporters, the Moros were kind of feeling neglected by the Philippine Republic. They were not recognized as who were recognized was mostly the major Christian population. They felt second class with the lesser cash capability compared to the majority, without even a share in their economic patrimony of their land, let alone that of the nation. This allowed the Moros to speak up more about their rights and about their place in the Philippine Republic. The third long-lasting effect of the Japanese occupation on Moro relations with the Philippine nation was the widespread distribution of arms and ammunition. After the long and painful process of disarming the Moros during the American and Commonwealth regimes, World War II provided the occasion of their being armed again. The Moros could not let go with their arms in the post-war, and so they used this as a power to fight against the government, the policies, the programs in which they didn't like. When Japan surrendered, its forces left the Philippines. Mindanao went back to normal, apparently, including the pre-war Muslim-Christian animosity. Of the three after effects of Japanese occupation, the third would have very serious implications on post-war Muslim-Christian relations. Indeed, in spite of the briefness of Japanese occupation in the Philippines and Moroland, it certainly influenced the molding of the post-war Moro-Filipino relation. So, as we can see right now in our current generation, we can see the Moros and the Christians to be living harmoniously together. The fight allowed people to reconcile and be one with each other. It allowed us to be together for a common cause. For the lessons learned and peace message showed that the Second World War in all its horrific episodes showed that Filipinos of whatever creed, status, or affiliation could work together toward common goals and objectives. The wartime experience of the Sulu guerrillas was a testimony that the Filipino people of diverse socio-cultural, political, and economic backgrounds could be indeed united, given the proper motivation and driven by shared dreams and aspirations. They could work together in defending their freedom and homeland. The Mindanao problem, for instance, can be resolved ultimately if all the stakeholders, the Moros and the Christians and the Lumads have a shared perception that under a political entity, nobody shall be left behind or discriminated against. With an inclusive economic growth and development, all sectors will be benefited under a regime of peace, harmony, equality, and justice. And that is all for my report. Thank you for listening and have a great day ahead.